Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar titled International Freight and Port Congestion, the Impact on Domestic Freights. I'm TCA's Vice President of Operations and Education, Jim Schoonover, and on behalf of TCA's Chairman, Jim Ward, President of DM Bowman, and TCA's entire leadership team, want to thank you for joining us today. I'd also like to express our sincere appreciation to Blume Global for their generosity in sponsoring today's webinar. Just a few reminders before we get started. Attending TCA's educational events, such as this webinar, provides you with an opportunity to earn a certificate in human resources, recruitment, and retention. We also offer a certificate of fleet management. Please visit truckload.org's education page to maximize your use of these complimentary member benefits and the opportunity to earn the credit and recognition for attending these events. Should you become disconnected today from this event, you may rejoin by clicking the link provided in your registration and reminder emails at any time. Also, a disclaimer has been posted in the chat window for today's session. Today's session is being recorded, and a link has also been posted in the chat where you can access the recording following today's webinar. Your TCA membership provides complimentary access to view the webinars on demand. Question for today's session can be submitted using your Q&A icon or the chat icon found at the bottom of your screen. We will acknowledge your question once it has been received. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have with us today Mr. Glenn Jones, Global Vice President of Product Strategy and Marketing for Blume Global, and David Arsenault, President of GSC Logistics Incorporated. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. And Glenn, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for joining today. We've got, I think, a very popular topic these days to discuss. And so I appreciate Dave joining me today. And, you know, he is right in the middle of what's happening in the import-export market on the West Coast, and certainly has knowledge from the other ports and seaports around the United States, or I'd say North America in general. So thanks, Dave. You want to quickly introduce yourself?
Well, thank you, Glenn, and thank you for having me here today. Again, as introduced, my name is Dave Arsenault, President of GSC Logistics. I'm based here out of the Port of Oakland, but have been in the supply chain for over the past 35 years in many different capacities, which I think I'll try to tie all into our presentation here today, from the ocean carrier perspective and the handoff that really takes place from international shipments to the domestic side, which are intrinsically linked. And in certain cases, there's that different line of demarcation that separates where the international begins and ends and where the domestic begins and ends. But all of them have similar challenges and characteristics that we'll try to cover today.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. And yeah, let's just start out by opening up the discussion around what's happening on the West Coast, both Long Beach, LA, and up into Oakland. So quick update, what's your perspective on what's happening there?
Well, you know, having been in this industry, in the supply chain in general for 35 plus years, I guess if there's I'd like to start with the glass being half full instead of half empty. And really where that comes into play is the supply chain in total has been generally out of sight, out of mind. And it's been something that's been relatively taken for granted until the pandemic. And the pandemic has really shined a light on the supply chain in general. And now it's kind of gone from the back room to the living room, where you can't even turn on the news anymore without some kind of fear about, you know, will Christmas still arrive this year, based on the disruptions that we're seeing up and down and throughout the supply chain. Starting kind of on the West Coast in the nation's largest port gateway in LA Long Beach, they've been averaging just over 70 ships that are either at anchor or adrift waiting for a berth, with about an average of a 13-day wait time before those ships are able actually to come alongside to a berth to begin their discharge operations. So the ports of LA Long Beach generally handle about 40% of the nation's total imports. So any disruption in that gateway is pretty catastrophic in terms of overall supply chain impacts throughout the rest of the network. And of course, about half of that volume doesn't just stay in the Southern California metropolitan area, but it's discretionary cargo that is ultimately scheduled by rail to move to some interior point. So even if you're not physically in the port of LA Long Beach, there are still implications for all of those of you who are downstream of that, waiting or involved at an interior point, whether it be Chicago or Dallas or Atlanta, that may have intermodal cargo connectivity destined to that particular area. As we kind of move up the West Coast to Oakland, I'm pleased to report that right now there are no real backups of any sort here in the Port of Oakland. But unfortunately, a big part of that solution was that many ocean carriers had bypassed Oakland, and we had seen some real cargo reductions in some of these areas. I am pleased to report that because of some of the disruptions that we're experiencing in other gateways, within the next 2 weeks, there have been a number of ocean carriers that have announced that they are restoring service back to Oakland, that there are some first call services that are coming to Oakland, which will also help kind of diversify and spread that cargo volume out across all the West Coast port gateways. And then if we move a little bit further to the north, up to the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Tacoma has also become very disrupted. And on average, they have about a dozen ships at any given point in time that are waiting either adrift or at anchor for a berth. And we've seen some pretty significant supply chain disruptions up in the Pacific Northwest as well. As we work our way around to the East Coast and Gulf Coast ports, the Gulf Coast had been relatively unscathed until recently, but we are starting to certainly see some backups there in Houston in particular. And then as we work our way around to the East Coast ports, the largest, the Port of New York, New Jersey, has certainly not gone without its fair share of challenges as well, with longer dwell times, longer wait times due to congestion on the terminal, where trucks are not getting in and out of the terminals there as quickly as they were pre-pandemic. And then, of course, working your way down the coast, the Port of Virginia, which had just completed some of its modernization projects with deepening the harbor as well as modernizing their second terminal there, has been perhaps a little bit less impacted than some of the others. And then, of course, Savannah has been pretty significantly impacted as well, with upwards of, at times, 20 ships waiting at anchor or adrift for a berth. So really, there's no place you can go in the supply chain right now that's been completely unscathed by the impacts of the pandemic. But each one of those locations that I just gave you is really its own independent ecosystem. And at any given point in time, when you freeze that moment in time, each one of those ecosystems may have a different pinch point that's really adversely affecting the overall supply chain in that particular geography.
Excellent. Thanks for that update. So as Blume, we provide technology, TMS type technology to some of the largest steamship lines and freight forwarders that support imports of cargo into LA, Long Beach, Oakland, most of the seaports in North America. And one of the key things that we're seeing right now is kind of a less availability of some of the key resources to move that cargo out. And the chassis, for example. And can you kind of highlight what's happening or what you're seeing there? Why are these chassis not as available as they normally would be? And same thing maybe for drivers or drayage carriers.
Well, that is a great question, Glenn. And there's really a number of different elements. If there was only one challenge that was affecting the global supply chain, it would be much easier to address and resolve. But it's really kind of the perfect storm of events. And it really starts with, we are seeing unprecedented record import cargo volumes that are arriving at ports throughout the United States. And whenever you have a supply chain that you put under stress like that, if there are any weaker links in that supply chain, they become very, very visible very quickly. So in a way, this stress test that we're encountering, we were eventually going to hit this with 3 to 5% growth every year. But when you start to look at a 20% growth, we just fast forwarded the clock to something that we maybe wouldn't have uncovered for another 4 or 5 years. We're seeing it pulled forward to right here and right now. As we really look at this, you know, it's really driven by cargo volumes that have really significantly increased, and also by some changes in buying behavior by U.S. consumers. We're seeing certainly the fastest growing segment, and GSC Logistics, we work with some of the largest retailers in the country with very specific logistics programs for them. When you start to look at buying behaviors, the fastest growing segment of any retailers right now are really in e-commerce. And e-commerce puts a different set of challenges on where when people are online looking to make a purchase, if you're stocked out, you're not going to generally find somebody that says, well, I'll just wait until they're in stock again for me to order this maybe next week or 2 weeks out. If you're stocked out of a particular product, somebody already has that tool in their hands where if you don't have it, maybe somebody else does. And if they want that immediate satisfaction and gratification of making an e-commerce purchase, if you stock outs usually generally results in a loss of a sale. So what we are seeing is, in order to support this growing e-commerce demand, which is really very much of a byproduct of the pandemic, but certainly something that I feel is going to continue well after post-pandemic days of continue, and it was already the fastest growing segment even pre-pandemic. It's forcing retailers to really look at their inventory control and management in different ways that really requires that next level of supply chain visibility, and to ensure that they have the right product in stock in the right place at the right time.
Yes, you know, and I know a lot of the DCs with the record imports are starting to fill up, especially along the West Coast. And, you know, there's only so much capacity sitting there. And so, you know, there's speculation out that some of the chassis maybe, you know, have containers that are being used as remote warehouses. And of course, you know, that's, you know, we see a little bit of that through our technologies. Also, I know, you know, there's a push to try to get the empty containers back, right? And so there's this whole initiative for the steamship lines to try to get the containers unloaded, get them back to the port, you know, sometimes bypassing export containers and getting them back to China or Southeast Asia, I should say. So let's kind of change topics a little bit in some of the initiatives to address this challenge. Talk a little bit about, so Biden is putting into action a motivation for the shippers, I'll say, and I guess also includes the, you know, some of the freight forwarders to get the containers out of the port. So I think going into effect mid this month. What are your thoughts and comments on the, I guess we'll call them tariffs or fees? Is that?
Yeah, I said I was kind of smiling when you said a motivation to get cargo moving. If you want to call a fine a motivation, I don't know. When first and foremost, you know, I think there's a lot of moving parts in the supply chain, and I think some of what has been announced so far are addressing symptoms, but not some of the root causes. And there is already a mechanism in place at every port in the country, something called demurrage, where if freight sits on the marine terminal above the number of days that each port tariff allows for free time, there's already a fee for cargo sitting on the marine terminal longer than beyond its free time. In Southern California, there's an additional fee now that's being imposed on the ocean carriers for any cargo that local cargo dwelling over 9 days, and for intermodal cargo that dwells over 6 days. Well, the interesting part of that is that, you know, about 80% of the cargo for local is merchant haulage, where the ocean carrier has no control over what's being drayed out or what the appointment schedules are or when it would get pushed out of the marine terminal. And they also aren't entertaining customer requests to hold cargo that's destined for Chicago at a marine terminal in Southern California. So that's really completely up to the marine terminals with their on-dock rail capabilities to help really support that. So there's a lot of finger pointing going on about where the cause of some of this is. The root cause is we have a velocity problem. And the velocity is being slowed both on the terminal at the marine terminals, but it's also velocity out on the street. And you alluded a little bit to it, Glenn, in your last question, which was with the warehousing or distribution centers that are ultimately receiving goods. And there's really three components that I see that are really at play here. And it differs from geography to geography or ecosystem to ecosystem. And it also varies a bit from client to client, customer to customer, retailer to retailer in terms of what might be happening. One, there are some warehouses, as you cited, that may be full, but people would kind of be scratching their heads. Why are there so many stockouts? And why is there so much fear that Christmas isn't coming? If the warehouses are so full, then is this a false alarm? So there are some warehouses that are full, and there are some that pulled their inventory ahead significantly in order to ensure that happened. But that is not across the board. There are just as many that are starving for business that have cargo waiting on one of those ships at anchor to come in. Part of that is then driven by labor shortages. We have seen in the pandemic and in the post-pandemic, as we're starting to transition out of, that some of the warehouse workers we're not finding returning back to working warehouses. There are labor shortages. There are requirements that are tied to COVID of having, limiting the number of workers that are unloading a container in a single container unloading at the same time, that are slowing down the unloading of containers and slowing down the velocity, as I was referring to. But then we've also have driver shortages, because at these same warehouses or distribution centers is often where the handoff takes place, coming back to our theme today, where the international shipment ends is at one side of that dock door, and where the domestic begins is on the other side of that dock door, where they're actually picking up goods from that warehouse, distribution, fulfillment center, or transload operation to take out to either another fulfillment center or to a store direct. And when you add all of those up together, what's happening is it's increasing the dwell time on the street. And what that's done is it's now causing boxes that maybe used to get turned in maybe 3 or 4 days, where an import goes out, it gets unloaded at a distribution center, and the empty gets returned, where you can then use that chassis to pick up the next inbound load. From going from a 3 or 4 day dwell time where it was pre-pandemic, we're now looking at 8 to 9 days. So if you think about what that does, it's put stress on now the chassis and the equipment that are needed to support that, where you need twice the number of assets to handle the same amount of volume, because the dwell time on the street has doubled. So many people take a simplistic approach to say, we just need more chassis. Well, that's all well and good, but eventually we'll be beyond this, and all those chassis will need a place to be stored when we start to see volumes come back to some level of normalcy again. And that just moves the problem someplace else. What we really need is to improve that velocity so we can get better utilization of the assets that are already available in the fleet, which is a much quicker solution than waiting for someone to manufacture a new chassis and have it delivered into the market.
Makes a lot of sense, and I agree. And so now there are different initiatives, I think, to try to improve that velocity from the seaport out to the DC or wherever it's going. I think one of them that is at least LALB. I think they're trying to open 24/7, and so that that's one thing I think to do. What are your comments on that? What's happening with the 24/7 operations?
This is another clear example of where there's a huge misunderstanding about a 24/7 operation. I think you've got to look at a marine terminal on 4 dimensions. And the first dimension is what happens on and off the ship. And marine terminals are working ships 24/7. When that ship comes into that berth, they are working that ship all throughout the day and the night. So that's one impact. The second is many of these, or most of these terminals now today, have on-dock rail, and they are also loading and unloading trains 24/7. The next is the gate. Now, the gate itself is not open 24/7, but there's appointment schedules at the gates. But if you think about these other 3 elements, what happens on and off the ship, what happens on and off an on-dock rail, and what happens in and out of the gate, all affect something called the yard. The yard is a victim of those other 3 dimensions. And if any one of those dimensions is working faster or not in sequence and alignment with the speed of the others, it causes a yard congestion problem. And really, the gate itself is the area that is one of those levers that needs to be used to kind of moderate what's happening in the yard. And there are times where a marine terminal actually needs to what we refer to as grooming the stacks, where they're actually reworking the containers in the yard to separate them from what's coming off the ship, move them to an area where they can be picked up by drivers that are coming in through the gate for local cargo pickups, and to help facilitate their appointment systems where you don't have the first driver in line coming to pick up a box that's buried on the bottom of a stack on the ground, but that it's bubbled up to the top. So there's a reduced number of non-productive moves to dig that box out. The problem is there's so much congestion in these terminals now, the number of non-productive moves required to dig a box out has gone up exponentially throughout this pandemic. So it kind of gets the terminal into this perfect storm of where they are rehandling so many of the boxes multiple times because they are dwelling there, and the congestion on the terminal is contributing to less efficiencies. So the marine terminals sometimes need to gauge what's coming in and out of the gate, the speed in which they're loading and unloading vessels. And remember, you have to unload the vessel before you load it. Maybe not 100% because you start loading back hatches once you've discharged a hatch so that you are optimizing the use of your yard, and the speed in which you're loading and unloading trains. And we're certainly seeing that. If there's a delay in Chicago and there's shortages at an inland rail ramp in Chicago, they're asking them to meter the train traffic that's destined for Chicago at a marine terminal, which is already congested. And that cargo that's discretionary, that's moving by rail, should be the most fluid cargo moving through the marine terminal at any given time. That's something the marine terminal has complete control of, and it is in their best interest to evacuate that intermodal cargo as quickly as they can, provided the railroads can accommodate that into their own network. So this is certainly a big factor that I think is getting a lot of attention right now. But there's just a lot of finger pointing going on instead of bringing everyone to the table to talk about a solution where everybody needs to be a part of the solution. And that, I think, is helping to contribute to why we're having kind of the disruptions and the delays that we're experiencing now.
It's essentially, I think, if I were to interpret your point, the 24/7 may actually, because the ports aren't used to that, running the gates open. So servicing the trucking companies 24/7, because there's the software or whatever's driving the yard isn't optimized for that yet. And if it's only a short period, it may never be optimized for that. It's actually may be causing a little more commotion. But GSC has dray carriers, and I know they're not in LA, or maybe they are in LALB. But does it also have an effect on the dray carriers? And what's going on with those companies now? They're expected to be able to pick up cargo 24/7. I think 5 days a week, maybe. Is that right?
So actually, and that's a great question, Glenn. Where in the drayage market, much different than the full truckload market, going from the current state to a 24/7 is like going from a crawl and bypassing the walk and the run to a sprint. I think there were some other logical next steps that needed to take place prior to just going to a 24/7 operation. Because again, a 24/7 operation is going to have limitations as well, based on, does that mean that every single row and every single part of the yard has to be open, where you have to have a full labor contingent that could possibly deliver any kind of size, type, style of equipment from any part of the marine terminal? And what they've seen is that there's been very few appointments that have been made to do that. Part of it is because if you pick up cargo in the middle of the night, can the warehouse even receive it in the middle of the night? And if the answer is no, now what is the driver going to do with that load he just picked up? So what I think a next logical step in the sequence of how do you improve the velocity through these marine terminals, which is really what the common theme here needs to be, is today in the drayage market, you've got mostly drivers working on a day shift, and we've been trying to incentivize more drivers to work on a night shift. And what we've kind of seen evolving over time here is kind of a hybrid model, where a day shift driver, if there's a gate open early, will come in a few hours early, and then he'll stop a few hours early, or he'll come in if the gate's not open early on time, and he'll stay a few hours after the end of his day shift to support some early hours in the night shift. And that doesn't really allow us to spread the volume out over a first and second shift as seamlessly as we'd like to. And part of what the limiting factor has been behind that is that many of the marine terminals were only open 4 nights a week. And for a driver to get his full hours of service in, if he was to shift over to becoming a wholehearted night shift driver that runs from like a 6 p.m. to a 3 a.m. shift on a West Coast port, he really needs to make sure that he's got 5 days a week where that full night shift is available for him to make the kind of income that he needs to generate and still operate within his hours of service. And I think that would have been a much more logical next step than just saying, let's just try to throw the gates open for 24/7 and see what happens, is to really make sure that there's at least that 5th night a week where that full night gate could be fully utilized, that there's enough warehouses and distribution centers open in that ecosystem to receive the cargo if it's removed from a marine terminal, and that where we can incentivize more drivers that have been working on a day shift to give them confidence that if they shifted to the night shift, that there's enough work and enough hours that the terminals are operating where they can get in their full hours of service and still may earn a decent living wage.
That makes a lot of sense. And we run analytics in our system, of course, where we manage the movement of a lot of cargo coming out of the West Coast ports. The one thing we have seen, and it's not, I don't think there's enough data yet to really say if it's a solution, is it does look like there's more turns in the evening. In other words, for a driver, less traffic, they don't have as much in between the port, and they can get in and out of the port a little faster. Not sure why. Maybe they have the stacks, groomed a little better. But the main thing is once they're out of the gate, getting to the destination and then getting back seems to be a little quicker. So there is that part of it. But again, you're running a swing shift and then a graveyard shift, and totally get what you're saying about they have to be able to do that 5 days. They have to be able to get in the number of hours. So that's definitely a negative side to it.
And I think what you would see, Glenn, if you drilled into the data that much deeper, is that on that first shift that runs from 8 to 5, that's the appointments are getting fairly fully utilized there.
Yep.
Where there's some finger pointing going on, I think, is marine terminals are saying that the warehouses are full, they're warehousing on wheels, and loads are staying out on the street longer, I think is only partially the truth. The second part of this is that those boxes really aren't all full and warehousing on wheels. They're out on the street longer, but they're empty now, and they're not able to get empties returned to the marine terminal. And it's vital that we fix that part of the supply chain, not just because the empty needs a place to be terminated so you can stop the clock on detention, but more importantly, to free up the chassis that empty is now sitting on to pick up the next import load and improve the velocity through the marine terminal. So there's some real challenges here where the dual transactions of returning an empty to pick up the next import load absolutely need to be improved. And we need to, ocean carriers are not asking to hold empties out, but when drastic times and the terminals are so congested, the easiest type of equipment to meter in are empty returns. But if you think about an ocean carrier, if you're bringing 100,000 containers a week in from Asia to the US, you need to send 100,000 containers back to Asia each week in order to balance your equipment theaters between Asia and the US. Otherwise, if you keep importing into the US more than you're sending back, you're eventually going to run out of equipment in Asia. And we're starting to see that happening now because we're not able to get as many empties back out as need to get returned. And that is also having an impact on the chassis availability. So we really need to be looking at how can we, if we know these are empties that are out on the street, those have got to get returned so we can free up the chassis. Otherwise, we're just in this tailspin and we're not ever going to get out of it. We have absolutely, that is going to be an absolute big part of the supply chain solution to overall improve each of the ecosystems in each port complex.
Makes perfect sense. And your point about, the dual transaction really makes that more efficient on the drayage carrier, on the truck driver. Yeah.
And the sell to the marine terminal is there's no net change in their yard density. You've received an empty,
yep,
but that driver has got to pick up an inbound load to get back out. So you still aren't increasing the number of boxes in the marine terminal. It's a 1-for-1 trade. And that empty will be able to get loaded back to the next ship that's coming in, which kind of maybe is a good segue into exports.
Yeah, but as we go there, that also saves on chassis too, right? Because
yes,
now you're making more efficient use of the chassis.
Yes.
Yeah, so let's segue into exports. That's a good, that's been another hot topic. So what's going on with exports? We know that the steamship lines are trying to get their empty containers back faster. So, they may not be taking all the exports, but elaborate on the other what's going on there.
Well, this is another area, and I have to say I really feel for the exporters. The importers are feeling the pain of what's being metered in because you can only get your imports as fast as the ships are able to get to the berth and get discharged and to take receipt of. The problem for the exporters is that vessel schedule integrity has been really out the window this year and for a good part of last year. Pre-pandemic, vessel schedule integrity, on-time performance was somewhere in the 80% range. Now it's about 30%. And even that might be a stretch in some different complexes and gateways. But that instability in the vessel schedules all has a huge impact on our poor export community, who also has production schedules that they're looking and working against. And depending upon when that vessel is eventually going to get to the marine terminal berth, the cutoff and the early receipt date has been a very dynamic part of that equation on when will they receive, what's the earliest receipt that they'll accept that box back in, and what is the cutoff, the latest that they'll accept that box back in to make that vessel that cargo has been booked to. But think of it this way, there are two ways to fill a ship, by weight and by cube. An import, a vessel coming into the United States filled with imports, with finished manufactured goods and the packaging material that goes around it, you can fill a ship up with imports based on cube. Every available slot that you can put a container on the ship will be used. The nature of the US export cargo is much different. And the number one export by volume is waste paper. But most of the volume, the most voluminous export cargoes are really raw materials, scrap metal, cotton, a lot of the raw materials that are required for the manufacturing taking place overseas. And that cargo tends to be very heavy. So a full ship for exports has generally been between 50 and 60% loaded containers and the other 40 to 50% with empties. And this was pre-pandemic. So this is not a pandemic new discovery. This has been the way it has been for as long as the industry's been around, based on just the nature of the import cargo and the weight that's associated with that versus the US export cargo and the weights that are associated with that. So ocean carriers have always had to limit the export loaded cargo volumes in order to accommodate the tare weights of the empty containers that they know they need to load on each ship to match back as many imports boxes that are coming in with the combination of loaded exports and empties back to Asia. Well, there should be no surprise that there's more empties going back to Asia right now, because we have that many more import loads coming in from Asia. So just doing the math, there should be an increase in export in empties going back to Asia. But what we've also seen is, because the export volumes have been and schedules have been so unstable, we've seen a bit of a modal shift, particularly from the US interior points, where a lot of the exports there are tied to grains and food, where it doesn't only, the only mode of transportation isn't necessarily container, it can also move in bulk. And we're seeing more activity on the rivers with barges that are then moving and being transloaded into bulk ships because of the instability with the ocean container market, and when cutoffs and early receipt dates have been shifting back and forth. There's been so much instability that the supply chain will always seek the path of least resistance, and exporters have had to become really pretty resourceful in finding alternative modes and transportation models to get export cargo like grain out of the country. So we've seen a modal shift. So that's why you're also seeing a reduction in the total export volumes, not to mention that ocean carriers have had to limit some of that because of the uncertainty of not being able to accommodate intermodal cargo being received in Chicago for a ship that might be waiting at anchor for 13 days on the West Coast that the marine terminal can't even unload and can't advance to an earlier ship because maybe letter of credit problems or other issues that don't always allow you to just put it out on the first ship. So it's kind of the perfect storm, and the export market has been really decimated by what we're seeing in this market. So there's been a lot of product that obviously there's better price points for a lot of exports for like fruits and nuts and some of the perishable goods that have had to really find new markets in the domestic market that would have preferred to have been moved in the past to international markets where there are better margins. So there's been a lot of dynamics happening here. Modal shifts, a shift more towards domestic versus international for exports, as well as the ever-changing cargo mix balance of how do you maximize the number of empties you can get back to Asia.
Yeah, necessity is the mother of invention, and that's it's so true in this world. I mean, we've been, as Blume, we've been working with a lot of exporters trying to find better ways to get better ERD data from the steamship lines, and so they can understand. And as you said, a lot of times that's bulk or it's heavier and it goes by rail. And so your commitment on rail is several days in advance of if you were just trucking it into the seaport. And so that's that's added to that challenge, I know. And I know we're working pretty hard to help those exporters. Changing topics a little bit again, driver shortage. And what do you see there? And what's there's a common that drivers are retiring they're no longer they may be gravitating towards domestic and regional as opposed to interstate. How do you see the driver shortage? Is there a driver shortage from your perspective and what you see in Oakland and other seaports? And then how is that impacting this?
Well, I think there's different, in each ecosystem, there are different challenges. And I think there are different challenges in the TL market versus the drayage market. So let's peel that back a little bit more. On the truckload standpoint, I think we have seen an exit of a number of drivers. Average age of drivers is over 55. as they're retiring and leaving the business. We don't have others that are coming in to necessarily replace them. And we're now seeing, even with some of the, some of the larger truckload carriers, which I think if you look at some of the data, you'll see that the 25 largest truckload carriers do about an annual of $25 billion of revenue per year. So it's a pretty concentrated market, but some of the new mandates about any employers over 100 people with mandatory vaccines, this could really make a bad situation even worse. The most recent jobs data did show a pretty healthy uptick in the number of drivers and warehouse workers that have returned to the workforce, but it still pales in comparison to where it was pre-pandemic. So we still are not out of the woods with that yet. And based on some of these new mandates, it could get worse before it gets better on the truckload side. On the drayage side, it's a much more fragmented market, and it's a much larger composition of individual owner operators, independent contractors, and subhaulers, where there's not going to be as much of an impact since they're their own businesses with the vaccine mandates. But there are others in different ecosystems with environmental impacts, where some of them are going to have to begin to replace trucks in order to meet new regulatory and environmental standards. And as that driver population ages, it's put a lot of stress on retaining and attracting new drivers into those markets based on the ever-changing rules of some of the regulatory and environmental policies that are happening at different locations around the country. So it is a challenge, but I think more so than just the number of drivers, it's also what we're seeing is the volatility in the supply chain volumes, where you kind of go from feast to famine, where there's a real spike in volumes in a certain point of time, and then we see something fall off, similar to what we saw here in the Port of Oakland, where there was some backups and there was some significant volumes that had come in, and then we saw a reduction, and those same drivers were looking for more work to do. We've also seen a change in some of that, where cargo that was ultimately destined for Oakland, that as carriers started to bypass Oakland, was now being discharged in LA Long Beach or up in even Seattle and Tacoma. And what that was doing, and still is continuing to do, is it's putting other pressure on an already stressed ecosystem, particularly on the driver pool. Instead of the driver making 4 trips for local drayage in a day, some of those same drivers are now doing a longer haul run from LA Long Beach up to Oakland over the road on a pool chassis, which has got to be returned back to that pool. So that's also increasing the dwell time on the chassis. Instead of it being a local dray where you can unload it in a local distribution center, it's coming over the road, longer haul, and it's got to be returned back to that ecosystem. So it's put more stress on the drivers, who are now not just doing local pickup and delivery drayage, to being pushed to do more long haul, and also the assets in each of these pool ecosystems to have to be suited to go longer distance over the road because of what I'll call unnatural routings, where these are all contingency routings with alternative gateways that are not the most natural gateways with the shortest distance from the port complex to the ultimate distribution center where the cargo is going to be devanned.
We had a couple of comments that came in over the chat channel, and we'll open it up in a minute to further questions. But one of them was, they said that Norfolk locks in the ERD 10 days out. Super helpful. You know, other railroads may follow suit. I guess we'll have to see.
Actually, that's more of a port. That's not so much a rail factor. That's a port component. And I think Savannah has also recently announced that they have done something similar, where the ERDs are a bit more static than the dynamics of not knowing exactly when the marine terminal is going to finish working this ship to allow the next ship that's scheduled to come in behind it, that they got an ERD and a cutoff for to continue to shift. So there's a little more predictability for that export community that's much needed so that they at least know that they can deliver the box to the terminal based after it's been loaded.
Another comment, increasing the hours of service for a driver. Of course, there's two sides to that, but they said Texas is increased the hours 1 hour, and what would 2 hours do? Again, it's that trade between the negative or the byproduct of that. So
the other thing besides that, Glenn, which I think is another area that could absolutely help, is a little bit of relief on some of the hours of service, is also lowering the driving age for new drivers that could be entering the market for interstate trucking. So that's another area that I think we've got to look at, very seriously, and how we can continue to attract the next generation into this much needed industry. Keep in mind, these were all designated as essential industries throughout the pandemic. These businesses, trucking did not shut down through the pandemic because supply chain is still vital. And so we've got to make sure that there's now increased spotlight on the importance of supply chain. Now we need to make sure that that spotlight, while it's shining as bright as it is, that we're really taking advantage of making sure that there are longer term changes to support all of the stakeholders that are necessary in the supply chain to keep it moving.
Yes. I've been working in supply chain for, I guess now 25 years, and seen several turns and evolutions in that time. There's a kind of a concept in supply chains called a bullwhip effect. And I think a lot of what you're alluding to is, we're at probably that maximum dampening on a bullwhip, and something will come out the end. Predictions going forward on what's going to happen through 2022. You want to take a crack at that? And in that, you might interlude any thoughts you might have on the ILWU negotiations.
Well, every year there's a different challenge to the supply chain. And that's really heightened the importance of having not just the physical movement of goods, but the visibility surrounding the movement of goods and the technology that plays that vital role in that as well. It used to be every 3 or 4 years there was some exception that would come up that really heightened that. Now it's kind of become the new normal, and I think that's going to continue in kind of a post-pandemic world. But if I can zoom out from just kind of a domestic focus to kind of an international global supply chain focus for a minute, this ties back into the prediction question. We saw earlier this year that, from a global pandemic standpoint, we're kind of very US centric in terms of looking at the last mile. But we've also seen that South China had some COVID cases. And when we were backed up earlier this year, we saw a little relief when China ended up shutting down a major part of the export volume coming out of South China, which allowed some of the ships in the pipeline that were waiting to get caught up and clean up some of the backlog. Then we saw that shift up to Ningbo, and that also shut down about 25% of the export cargo coming out of Ningbo, which also allowed the US supply chain to catch up. But essentially, the US is not able, China can pitch more than the US supply chain infrastructure can catch. And we need to look at, this infrastructure bill and some of the investments that need to be made in bridges and roads, and having more of a comprehensive nationwide supply chain transportation strategy in the US, so that we're able to make sure that we're able to accommodate these kind of record volumes coming in, because it's going to continue. We are seeing now maybe the next breath of relief is, we're getting through right now we're still in deep peak season. We've got Chinese New Year at the beginning of February, where we'll see a little bit of a continued push in January prior to that. But right now we're also seeing electrical shortages in China that are impacting production, and kind of the post holiday retail surge that has taken place with everything that's already on the water to get in for the retail season, taking kind of a breath right now. And I'm hoping that that's going to allow us to start catching up in some of these gateways where there are significant backups and congestion to start to get ahead once again. So I do think that, you know, there's some hope in sight. It's going to take some time to work some of the kinks out of each of these links in the supply chain. And at any given moment where you freeze the supply chain in time, there's been a slightly different pinch point that is impacting the overall supply chain and that ecosystem. And that ecosystem can only go as fast as the slowest link. So that link changes from time to time, and we've got to make sure that we're addressing that all the way through. As far as next year, and you know, the kind of the unknown is on the West Coast, the ILWU contract expires at the end of June. And of course, it's anyone's guess as to what impact that might have on, you know, causing any potential disruptions as we may have seen in previous contract negotiations. But that's certainly one that everyone needs to keep on their radar screen as, you know, a little bit of a cloud of uncertainty that could, in a post-pandemic environment, you know, be the next challenge that we'll need to overcome in 2022.
Excellent. And so, yeah, you know, it's so true that there's always a bottleneck, and it's somewhere. And you know, it could be manufacturing upstream as it had been in the past, or maybe the steamship lines. But you know, mostly it's been, at least in the United States, you know, from the port inland into the hinterlands in the U.S. So looking out past you know, 2022 and looking at sort of the future, autonomous trucks, you know, removing one of the bottlenecks potentially. They're building new DCs all across the U.S. Kind of, you know, what are your thoughts out past 2022?
You know, as we look at that, I think that technology is going to continue to play a significantly larger role in overall goods movement. It's not just the challenges of the physical movement of the goods, but it's the visibility to anticipate where that next pinch point will be, and to develop early in your supply chain strategy contingency plans to try to work around them, whether it's a labor event, whether it's a weather event, or some other kind of catastrophic event that might be happening that's having some kind of an impact, or just supply and demand. And we're seeing that is also kind of a byproduct of where we see things happening now with transloading and dynamic allocations while cargo's en route on the ocean to fulfillment centers across the country based on where spikes in demand might be happening, or weather events might be causing either a spike in demand or a reduction in demand. And there's alternative measures and plans that need to be taken into account very, very dynamically. I think from the autonomous truck piece, I do think that there's a part for that, but I'm actually more of a proponent of the convoys. I think that is going to be kind of that next breaking technology for some of the longer over-the-road truckload business with convoys that you know, that will involve autonomous vehicles, but operating in more of that convoy type of an environment. I don't see it as much in the drayage industry because of the dynamics of getting in and out of marine terminals, the safety issues that are tied to that with, you know, moving into a marine terminal where you've got labor that are loading and unloading trucks or containers to and from chassis. That I think there's a human element that's going to continue to be a big part of that going forward. But I do feel that we're going to see, and we need to see, a much heightened movement towards a broader use of technology in all aspects of the supply chain, from marine terminals and marine terminal efficiency to over the road and autonomous vehicles in that type of a convoy environment.
Excellent, thanks. Yeah, I know there's a lot of experiments with that in some of the less populated areas like Montana, and we're all holding hope that that works out well. Essentially, a train on a freeway. Yes. So a little more agility. Cool. Well, let's, that's kind of the end of the topics that wanted to discuss, but I want to open it up for questions. And so I'm looking at the chat channel now and want to see if anybody has any additional questions. I appreciate all the great feedback that's coming over the chat. Thank you very much. It's always wonderful to have Dave. He's so plugged into this market and what's happening in the seaports. Great, rich history of working in that part of the economy. So thanks much. Any other questions out there? We're about up on time, I believe, also. So, well, just a quick on. Want to give a little bit on Blume Global. We're trying to do our part in helping out here too. We have recently introduced a marketplace for drayage and drayage carriers, and we're in the process of integrating chassis into that. So as you're moving, cargo into and out of the seaports, it's pretty much around the U.S. We're working in conjunction with some of the steamship lines, freight forwarders, and of course, our network of dray carriers that's international, but primarily the ones in North America right now. So we call it Carrier Go Live. And it's essentially a marketplace where shippers can do spot market with rates with drayage carriers to find both dray capacity and chassis capacity. So thanks. Else? See, there's a comment coming in on railroad efficiency, and I'll just say some of our largest customers are Union Pacific and CSX and Norfolk Southern. But it's mostly on the domestic side, although we are also support, but they're inefficient, and I know, working very hard. So we now post the intermodal or interline schedules, the intermodal for intermodal freight on rail for CSX and Norfolk Southern and UP. And so if you're moving cargo, domestic or international across the U.S., I mean, we now are publishing those schedules, which they weren't published before. And you can get a better idea of what the schedules are, and we update those almost dynamically. So I know the railroads are really trying to focus and they of course compete with over the road. And one of the advantages is cost, but on the flip side, everybody knows on-time performance today is extremely important, and so we're working very closely with them to try to provide and work the performance issues. So any other points? All right. Thanks much. Jim?
Yes, thank you. It looks like we're wrapping up with the questions. Great information, great conversation. As you can see, the attendees are very appreciative of what you've shared. David, Glenn, thank you so much for the insights you've shared today. For the attendees, we'd like to say thank you for joining us. And once again, we encourage you to take advantage of the recording that will be available, and also of the certificate programs that you can take advantage of through your membership with TCA. I also want to remind you that we've provided contact information for both Glenn and Dave earlier in the session. So please, if you have further questions, I know they'll appreciate answering them or being of service or support. So please use that information to reach out as needed. So gentlemen, once again, thank you. I'd like to thank again the audience for attending today. And this wraps up our webinar for the afternoon. So please enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and best in luck out there. Have a great afternoon all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. Always pleasure.